Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with Dr. Eric J. Dolin, the author of Rebels at Sea, Privateering in the American Revolution. He's written more than a dozen books and has his PhD from MIT in environmental policy. Thanks so much for being here, Dr. Dolin.
Thanks for having me.
Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. George Washington led the troops. There was a small navy on one side and a much larger navy on the other. There were a number of mistakes by the British that opened the door for the colonists to keep fighting. There were spies and backstabbers and deals and tens of thousands of deaths. What Eric J. Dolin, though, argues is that there were also privateers, both boats and people, we'll get to that in a minute, who were critical in supplementing the continental forces. Think of how much better, for instance, even an inferior baseball team like the Yankees would be if they could put in two more outfielders to supplement who was already out there. So, Dr. Dolin, why is understanding what happened on the water so critical to understanding the Revolutionary War?
Well, first, definition probably is in order. Privateers are vessels that are owned and outfitted by private individuals that are given permission, government permission, to attack enemy vessels during times of war. And that permission comes in the form of a letter of marque. And they're sort of like a cost-free navy or a militia of the sea. And the reason that privateering was so important during the American Revolution is that even a well-functioning, well-funded government would have had a difficult time putting together a navy that could go toe-to-toe with the Royal Navy, the most powerful one on the seas. The Continental Congress wasn't well-funded. They couldn't levy taxes. They weren't particularly well-organized. They were like herding 13 cats or 13 colonies, trying to get them to row in one direction. So in that event, because they had a difficult time pulling together a navy, privateers rushed in to fill the void. They were sort of ready-made vessels. They were former merchant vessels, fishing vessels that had been laid up because of the British crackdown on the Americans. And not only had the vessels been laid up, but all the individuals who worked on those vessels, all the mariners were suddenly out of work. So you had a potential source of privateersmen, the people that go on the privateers. You had a potential source of the vessels. You had merchant owners who wanted desperately to do something productive with their ships. And privateering was a potentially productive avenue that not only would add to their own profits, but also was a patriotic endeavor that would help win the war. So it was really a case of necessity being the mother of invention here and leading to privateering.
And why was it so important? Why is it so important for us to understand the aquatic aspect of the Revolutionary War?
Well, the American Revolution is the seminal event in the history of this nation, right up there certainly with the Civil War, which was seminal in a different manner. And there are thousands and tens of thousands of books that talk about the American Revolution, and people have been dissecting why we won, how we won, what it was like during the American Revolution for decades and centuries. And when I read the landscape of the literature, what struck me is that there was very little about privateering, and there certainly was no narrative history that really pulled together all the different threads of privateering and how it interacted with the rest of the war effort and why it was so important. So if you want to understand how this country came to be, why we beat, which was what was clearly the most powerful nation on earth, it was a very tenuous affair. As Washington said, it was a standing miracle that we won. There were many different factors that went into it. It wasn't just General Washington land-based fighting, the Continental Navy, small though it may be, French assistance. It was also privateering, because you have to keep in mind there were nearly 2,000 privateers that went to sea. They employed roughly 20 to 30,000 men. They brought in nearly 2,000 British ships. This had a major impact not only on the British side of the Atlantic, but also on the American side of the Atlantic.
It has become almost cliche. I mean, it's one of the facts you remember from like middle school American history class that the British Navy and the British military was massive back then, and the Americans wasn't. Strip away the headlines for us. Describe what the differences were in terms of numbers, in terms of equipment, training, command structure. Focus on the aquatic aspect of this, the Navy aspect of this, and break all that down for us.
Sure. No, the British Navy, they were definitely the lords of the ocean. They felt themselves, they perceived themselves that way, and they definitely were. At the outset of the war, there were 270 Royal Naval vessels, many of them ships of the line, some with 64, upwards of 80 or 100 cannons on board. They had a huge cadre of Royal Marines and sailors who knew how to fight, who knew how to sail. And so it was right for the Americans to fear them. And the Americans never conceived of going toe to toe with the Royal Navy. Even the Continental Navy that we established, which was only 60 vessels strong, its main focus was going to be, just like privateering, to attack British merchant ships, to try to cause pain, economic pain, to Britain. Now, the Continental Navy, at 60 vessels, many of them were captured by the enemy, some sunk in port. They really didn't have a very good record. John Adams, who was a big proponent of the Navy, later said that when he reflects on their history, he couldn't help but being brought to tears. And it was into that void that privateering went. And privateering was doing the same thing that the Navy was trying to do, even though privateers did engage with a few Royal Naval vessels. So it was great temerity on the part of the Americans to think that they could do anything at sea. And that's certainly how Britain viewed it. They were shocked that these ports in America were sending forth all these privateers to harass their merchant fleet. They were really shocked at this. And the Americans were scared about doing this. But what they found is they had the ability at the margins, certainly, to have an impact on Britain and ultimately British policy.
I realize that you may not be a traditional historian of the revolution, but as best you can, set the stage for this clash. What were the politics in each country? What was the appetite for war? If you will, what was on the ground, and what goals did each team have coming into this very big matchup?
Well, in 1775, 1774, what happened is in the colonies, there was great distress over particularly the navigation laws and the trade restrictions that the mother country was placing on the colonists. And also, the mother country had funded the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, and that had caused significant financial disruptions on that side of the Atlantic. So they were trying to recoup some of their costs from the Americans whom they had defended. And of course, the Americans had fought alongside the mother country. So there was a lot of financial unrest leading up to the American Revolution. You had the British wanting to recoup some of their costs and also clamp down on the Americans who were getting a little bit feisty. You had the Americans who wanted to be able to trade wherever they wanted to go. They didn't feel they needed to help repay the coffers of the British government for the French and Indian War, because they had died right alongside with their British counterparts. And so it basically was almost a financial clash at some level, and also a clash of the concept that the Americans were treated like second-class citizens. There is some truth to the, taxation without representation cry that we often hear and learn about in high school. The Americans felt aggrieved. They were having taxes levied upon them, and they didn't have an equal voice within Parliament. They felt like second-class citizens, and they, in fact, under the mercantile theories of the day, they were treated like second-class citizens. So this clash was brewing, but in the beginning, and I think something that a lot of people forget, is that in 1775, even after the Battle of Lexington and Concord, after the bloody Battle of Bunker Hill, the Americans, most of them, did not want to leave Great Britain. They viewed Parliament and Lord North as the main problem, and they felt that King George III was still on their side. He was our leader. And yet what was happening is that the British were trying to clamp down, particularly on New England, particularly on Boston, and they were taking a lot of American ships and they were attacking American ports. So what the Continental Congress decided to do is not declare independence, but they told the colonies, you need to go out and defend yourself on the oceans against the British. And one of the ways that colonies chose to do that was by coming up with privateering.
And what role was the ocean and the water? What role did it seem like it was going to play as this conflict began? I'm not sure if it's important to talk about, which battleship was where, right? It reminds me of the game "You Sunk My Battleship." But what role was this kind of destined to play, the ocean destined to play, in how the war itself, which I guess you could say was predominantly fought on land, although you might disagree with that. Where was the ocean set to kind of play a role in this conflict?
Baking from our childhoods just sticks in the memory, doesn't it? We never set off on holiday without piles of Tupperware. And there'd always be Bakewell slice, flapjacks, and tray-baked scones in the boot.
Do you not do that, Lisa?
Yeah, no. Sadly, I do not stack the Tupperware in the back of the car when we go off on holiday.
Oh.
Welcome to Small Ways to Live Well, a new podcast from the Simple Things magazine. Season 2 is a pick-me-up tonic that helps us make the shift from winter to spring. A 6-week suggestion box full of things to note, notice and enjoy about the season. Search for Small Ways to Live Well on your podcast app.
Well, the ocean was pivotal. It was central. It was the highway for everything that transpired on land, as well as things that happened on the ocean. It was very important for the British to maintain control of the high seas. If they couldn't resupply their troops or even get their troops to the colonies, they couldn't wage a war. With the Atlantic dividing the two combatants, it created an extremely difficult logistics problem for Britain because they were fighting a war on the enemy's turf. So if they couldn't bring their ships in, if they couldn't get their supplies over to the Navy and the Army, they would have been literally, sorry for the pun, dead in the water. And they were fairly effective in getting stuff over there, especially after they took control of New York early in the war. So the ocean was central to the American Revolution. And then on top of it, the role of privateering was a subset of the importance of the maritime war. And I think the maritime war, yes, if I had to balance it out, the war on land and the battles fought on land were more critical, were more numerous. Well, maybe not more numerous, but the battles fought on the ocean and the captures that took place in the ocean were very important. And of course, the French coming to our aid in 1781, the Battle of Yorktown, that's a maritime component that was critically important.
And it's really important, I think, for us to put ourselves back into the 1770s. Right now, we don't need the ocean to send a message. We don't necessarily need the ocean, although it, of course, is to ship things. It just doesn't play the same role in our infrastructure that it used to. Describe, if you can, how what was happening on the water impacted life in the colonies separate from the war.
Separate from the war, I mean, if you consider the colonies before the outbreak of the war, their number one trading partner was Britain and British colonies in the Caribbean. It was the lifeblood of the colonies, trading with Britain, because they were restricted due to navigation acts for just taking a ship and going to China, for example. All their Chinese and Far Eastern goods from India, the teas, the silks, the porcelain, all of those things had to filter through British ports in the mother country, and then they would go to the colonies, and all of the goods that the colonies were producing, and not so much goods, but raw materials, the masts and oars and other things and wool that the colonies were producing would then in turn go to Britain. So the connection between the two, the American colonies and the mother country, was as tight as could possibly be imagined. And that's part of the reason why it was difficult for people to conceive of breaking free from Great Britain, because so much of colonial commerce and life was based on what was happening across the ocean.
I'm certainly no sailor myself. Based on what I've heard and what I've interviews that I've done with other authors, life on the water in those days was not great. Was
Yes.
very difficult. Can you describe what it would be like to get onto a boat for a long period of time, no matter what your goal is, whether it's travel or privateering or what have you? What was life like on the water over a long stretch period of time?
Yeah, it was a miserable experience. I mean, think about it. Back then, I mean, not only did you have to be worried about getting to where you wanted to go, we didn't have navigational equipment and GPS and stuff that we have today. They basically used dead reckoning, and they didn't know if a hurricane or a major storm was brewing over the horizon. And it was very difficult to find out just physically where you were on the ocean. And then you throw into the mix the fact that you're on a ship for an extended period of time, the food that starts out with you, assuming that it was fresh and good when it starts out with you, after a few weeks starts to become maggot infested and tastes horrible, and that's what you are forced to eat. Maintaining fresh water is very difficult at sea. That's part of the reason, not the only reason, why they brought a lot of alcohol along. Alcohol was, everybody in the colonies was sort of mildly inebriated at the time, because drinking water was a potentially dangerous proposition because of microbes, and alcohol tended to kill or purify the water. So that's why everybody was drinking weak beer and other stuff. But even that could not overcome all the other discomforts that you would find on a ship at sea, even a large ship. It's you can't take showers. Not that they took a lot of showers back then. You're sweaty. You're sleeping in the below decks. And if you're in a tropical area and it's warm, it's incredibly hot. It's incredibly cramped. It smells. There are vermin. There are cockroaches. I mean, every once in a while, ships at sea try to smoke out the rats and the cockroaches. They're not always successful. And if you're a privateer or a continental Navy vessel, you have a lot of people on board. You could have a 70-foot sloop or a brig that has 100 men on board for 3 months at a time. Just think about those crowded, cramped conditions. And all you're seeing is the ocean. Every once in a while, especially during the war, a ship appears on the horizon. You don't know if it's an enemy. You don't know if it's a friend. You have to suss that out somehow by getting close enough and maybe pulling out your speaking trumpet and yelling across the water to figure out who that person is, or assuming that the flags that they've raised are actually their real flags and not a ruse de guerre where they're trying to draw you into a battle. So that was a moment of potential panic when you came upon another ship at sea, even during times of peace, because there were occasional brigands out there in the ocean, although far fewer in the mid 1700s than there were in the early 1700s. But then you throw the American Revolution into the mix, and you have to figure out whether it's a British ship, a Dutch ship, a French ship, a Spanish ship, friend or ally. And then if it's a foe, if it's an enemy, there might be a bloody battle that ensues. So being on a ship could be a miserable experience with or without war. I think being a writer is much easier.
And now for the good news. I'm going to take a hard pass on that lifestyle you just described. What was life like for a privateersman, for the people on board these ships? What did they do all day before the war started?
Well, before the war started, they weren't privateersmen. I mean, you only become a privateersman and you enter on a privateer and have a letter of marque. So before the war, a lot of these men, they were mostly in their late teens and 20s, because a maritime life was not for the old and infirm, and people didn't get quite as old back then as they do now anyway. So the average age of these privateersmen and mariners was in the late teens, early 20s. And before the war, most of them were sailors, merchant mariners, or fishermen. And they're also on privateers. There were quite a few landsmen, because once privateering got going, a lot of men who worked the farms, who were laborers on land, looked at privateering as an opportunity not only to fight for their country, but perhaps even more importantly, to potentially earn a good payday. So they left their farms and they entered into privateers. But once the war started and you were on a privateer, your life was much like I described before, except it was perhaps even scarier. because you are intently going out there to confront the enemy. And don't believe that when you think about, oh, they're going after British merchant shipping. A lot of British merchant vessels of this time, especially after the war began, were outfitted with a serious number of cannons and muskets. And they had men on board, sometimes Marines even, who would be willing to fight. And in the book, I have a number of encounters where quite a few people end up dead or seriously wounded in an encounter. And even worse than that, a lot of privateers, American privateers, were captured by the British. And if they were captured, the men on board would be sent to British prisons. And sometimes they would be sent to the prison ships in New York, which was almost certainly a death sentence for most of them.
What a what a life. I always ask this question because I think it's important, and some of our listeners are curious about the process of writing books. So what were your sources for this particular book? You mentioned in the book that you went to the Library of Congress and there was a fascinating book on the history of, I think, naval vessels. But what did you plumb, and how did you find enough material to write a whole book on privateersmen?
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I've written 15 books. Most of them have been, almost all of them, on topics that I didn't know much about before I started the work, because I like to remain engaged. It's sort of like getting a master's degree every 2 years. And the most paralyzing, not paralyzing, because I don't get paralyzed by it, but the most frightening part of writing a book is sort of the very beginning, when you see this horizon of information that you have to go out and gather and figure out what you want to use. And most often there is more than enough information, and it's really selecting the best sources to weave together a narrative that's going to get people not only to read it, but also learn the topic that you want to get across. So for this book, what I did initially is there were a number of maritime and American Revolutionary histories that would mention a little bit about privateering. And I read through a lot of those to get my overall skeletal framework. And there were a couple of books written in the 1800s, late 1800s, that focused on privateering specifically. What I found out later is that a lot of the facts in those were wrong, but they nevertheless were valuable as giving me a skeletal framework. But then I dove into the primary materials as much as I could. The Continental Congress, the journals of the Continental Congress, have a lot of information about the creation of the Privateering Act and the activities of privateers during the war. Massachusetts was the first colony to establish a Privateering Act. There are great records here in Massachusetts, where I am, of the debates that took place in pulling that act together. And then there's information in local newspapers. You have to remember that during the American Revolution, there were about 30 newspapers across the colonies. A lot of them were concentrated in ports, the very places from which privateers emanated. So there were a lot of newspaper articles on privateer activities. And I combed through all of those as far as I could tell. Yeah. I spent days and days looking through digital databases. And then there were also books, contemporary books. There were 4 or 5 memoirs that were written specifically by privateersmen who had spent time in the Jersey prison ship in New York, the most horrific of all the prison ships. And not only did they talk about their horrible time on the Jersey, they also detailed their earlier career as a privateersman. So there were a lot of sources I was able to draw upon. You mentioned the Library of Congress. That was somebody in 1906 went through all the records we had at the federal level and some state level and listed all the vessels that got letters of marque and their names, when they sailed, who their captains were, the complement, the armaments. And that was very, very helpful in getting another broad sense of how big of an industry, in effect, privateering was. But part of the way that I research is by Brownian motion, by knocking into things. When I read this document, it mentions something that causes me to go, hey, that's really interesting. Let me go down that rabbit hole. Hopefully it's not a rabbit hole, but go down that path a little ways and see if I could find something to add to the narrative. But in the end, I spend a lot of time deciding what I can't use in the book, almost as much as deciding what I can use. Because with 20 to 30,000, maybe even more privateersmen and nearly 2,000 privateers, there are a lot of potential stories. And so invariably, I've gotten emails from probably 30 people since this book came out in May who have ancestors who were privateersmen. And they say, is my great, 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 great grandfather in your book? And 9 times out of 10 or even more, I have to say, unfortunately, no. With so many privateersmen, only a certain number get into the book. But there have been a couple people who've reached out to me whose ancestors are in the book. And one of the most interesting was I start the book off with a tale about Jonathan Harrison.
Oh, that was going to be my next question. I was going to say, perfect. You segued right into it. So go ahead, keep going then. Keep kicking.
I start off the book with this tale about Jonathan Harrison, and I'll tell the tale in a second, abbreviated form. But he was a privateersman from Salem, Massachusetts. He sailed out of Salem, Massachusetts on a vessel called the Pickering, and he was quite successful. And again, I'll get into the story in a second, but I gave a talk, I think it was about a month and a half ago in Hull, Massachusetts on rebels at sea. And in the audience were 2 guys named Harrison. They were brothers, and both of them are direct descendants of Jonathan Harrison.
That's cool.
So that was a lot of fun meeting them and signing books for them. But anyway, Jonathan Harrison, he was originally in the State Navy for Massachusetts on a vessel called the Tyrannicide, a great name for a vessel going out to beat King George III, in effect. And he got into a dispute over pay, so he left the State Navy, and then he became a privateersman, a captain of privateer vessels. And one vessel was called the Pickering. And he captured a number of vessels. He captured many British prizes, brought them back to Salem, hundreds of cannons, hundreds of prisoners, and made a lot of money for his owner and for himself. But one battle in particular started off the book. He was going to Bilbao, Spain, in the summer in June of 1780. And one other little segue, he was on a letter of marque privateer. There are straight privateers, which are going out only to attack British merchant ships. And then there are quote unquote letter of marque privateers. They both have letters of marque, but these ones were called letter of marque because they not only had permission to attack and capture British merchant ships or naval ships, but they also were on a trading mission. So Pickering was captain. So Harrison was captain of the Pickering, heading to Bilbao, Spain, at the time one of our allies, a very large port. On the way, he captures a British vessel called the Golden Eagle. And right off of Bilbao, late in the day, he sees in the distance a British ship called the Achilles, a very large British ship. He has a British prisoner on board who tells him the power that the Achilles has. Essentially, the Pickering had 38 men on board and 16 cannons. The Achilles had 132 men on board and 43 cannons. Not a fair fight. The British prisoner thought Harrison was going to flee, but Harrison wasn't that kind of guy. He was as cool as a cucumber. He liked fighting, and it was late in the day. He knew they weren't going to fight at night. It's preferable to see a little bit better. So he said, I'm going down below. I'm going to sleep. I'm sure the Achilles is going to come forward the following morning. Wake me as soon as the Achilles starts moving. And in the process, the Achilles had already retaken the Golden Eagle from Harrison. So he goes to sleep, and word spreads in Bilbao that there's going to be this epic battle offshore, and about 1,000 people go down to the beach to watch the next morning. Well, the sun comes up. Harrison walks to the main deck, comes up to the main deck. He's made aware of the fact that the Achilles is approaching. He also is keenly aware that he is understaffed. He has not enough people. So he has a bunch of British prisoners on board. He says, anybody who steps forward and fights with us will get a cut in the prize money. 10 of them step forward. So now he's got 48 men, which are better able to man the cannons. Well, the battle lasts for 2 hours. And towards the end of the battle, Harrison has his men put bar shot in the cannons, which is basically 2 cannonballs connected by an iron bar. And when that comes out of the cannon, it starts spinning wildly, and it can shred rigging and sails and even damage a mast or a spar if it hits it dead on. So this was too much for the Achilles to take. There was too much damage. The Achilles turned and fled. Harrison tried to pursue, but he wasn't as fast as this much larger ship. He spun around. He recaptured the Golden Eagle, and then during the battle, another thing that's interesting, during the battle, one of his men said that he was as calm as if, while bullets are flying around his head, he was as calm as if he was in a shower of snowflakes. One of the men on board the Pickering had his head sheared off and died. 8 men were severely wounded. So the Pickering goes into Bilbao, and word spreads about this great American victory. And Harridan and his crew are treated like heroes. And he stays in Bilbao for a little while, goes back to Salem. On the way back, true to form, Harridan captures 3 more British ships. And when he gets back to Salem, the owners of the Pickering are so proud of their intrepid captain that they give him a beautiful silver tankard and 2 silver cups inscribed with the profile, the image of the Pickering and his initials. And the last thing, when he died in 1803, at the age of 63 from tuberculosis, the local paper, the Salem Gazette, lauded him as one of the greatest, fighters and men and patriots of the American Revolution. And I have to add one funny story. I think it's funny. It's not in the book.
I mean, there really should be a movie optioned about this guy, whether it's from your book or I guess we hope from your book. But I mean, this is like Rambo here.
Yeah,
he's a maritime Rambo.
The only thing I wish, and this is the same problem I had with my book on pirates, Black Flags, Blue Waters. No pirates sat down to write their memoirs. Very few privateersmen sat down to write their memoirs. I wish Harridan had. We'd have a lot more information about him, but he is a great character. But this final story, while I was writing the book, actually 2 stories I want to share. While I was writing the book, I came across a reference to a bronze plaque, a metal plaque that had been placed in Salem on the side of a house that honored Harridan and his battle with the Achilles. So I hopped on my bike. This is right at the height of COVID. I biked over to Salem, which is right next to Marblehead. I looked in the square where it was supposed to be. I couldn't find it. I came back home. I called a local historian. I said, "Where's this plaque?" And she laughs. She goes, "It's in a Korean barbecue restaurant down the street," which it was. So I got back on my I got back on my bike. I biked back over. I walk into the restaurant, and there behind the where the cash register would be, now they just have a computer, was the plaque. It's a 2.5 foot wide by 3 or 4 foot tall, beautiful plaque honoring Jonathan Harridan. And to me, that is emblematic of how privateering has been treated in American history, relegated to a Korean barbecue restaurant. And nothing against Korean barbecue, it's great, but I just thought it was a sad place for this plaque, one of the few tributes we have in the United States to privateersmen, where we have many tributes to Continental Navy captains and officers. But let me add one other thing. Sorry, we talked about this earlier, and I think your listeners might be interested in this little story. COVID has thrown us all into a tizzy. It upended our lives, and it almost caused this book to be quite different. Just a week before the COVID emergency was declared, which was only a few weeks after I signed the contract for this book, I decided to go into the Harvard Widener Library, which I use a lot. I have access to it. I use it a lot for my research. One of the greatest libraries in the world, has a huge number of databases of primary materials. For whatever reason, I didn't know the national lockdown was coming. I spent 2 days at Harvard downloading hundreds of documents that were important in writing this book. And then all of a sudden, a few days later, the lockdown happens, Widener Library shuts, my access to all those databases evaporated. And I even put this in the acknowledgments because it was so important. I believe that if I hadn't had all those documents on my computer, on my little stick drive that I downloaded to my computer, I certainly wouldn't have been able to write the book that I did write. And who knows, I might not have been able to write the book at all.
Isn't it funny how little twists of fate change so much? It's crazy.
Yeah.
I'll quote a little bit from the book here. You say they took, meaning the privateers, they took the maritime fight to the British and made them bleed in countless daring actions against British merchant ships and not a few warships. Privateers caused British maritime insurance rates to rise, diverted critical resources and naval assets to protecting their vessels, added to British weariness over the war, and brought France to the American side. That paragraph sums up the impact that you obviously argue that privateers had. Why has, as you put it, that story been relegated to a wall, a plaque on a wall in a restaurant, in a nondescript place in Massachusetts?
Yeah, good question. But before I answer that, let me add the other side of that, because I think this is part of it. It's the next paragraph, actually. The privateersmen and privateers had a huge impact on the home front as well. The goods that they brought into the colonies were very important at a time when commodities were scarce. They employed tens of thousands of people that would have otherwise been idled and may have become a threat to the future unity of the revolutionary cause. And they really gave some hope to Americans who are reading these accounts of privateering that this quixotic war might actually be won. So there's both the home front side of it and what they were doing for Great Britain. But as to why we don't know about it or why it got relegated to the dark recesses of history, I think there are a couple of reasons. One of which is that after the war was over, there wasn't a privateering organization that was established to pull together the history. Whereas for the Continental Navy, in effect, there was. The Continental Navy disbanded at the end of the war, but by the end of the 1700s, the United States Navy had formed, and it's been around for a couple of centuries. And they have done a great job in documenting their own history, including the history in the American Revolution. There's not a, excuse me, my allergies are kicking up.
That's all right. We all get them.
There's not, I just think I said, there's not a parallel organization like the Knights of Pythias or whatever, the Elks Club for privateersmen. So that's one issue. There wasn't an institution that was devoted to telling the story. Second, a lot of privateersmen, even the captains, were relatively unknown, certainly not famous individuals before the war. And after the war, they just wanted to get back to making money. They weren't typically the type of people who write their own memoirs, whereas a lot of the founding fathers and a lot of the naval captains came from very wealthy families, were very well educated, and had a vested interest in writing down their perspective on the American Revolution and their role in it. So a lot of privateersmen didn't do that. A lot of them, unfortunately, almost 11,000 probably on the Jersey alone, died during the war. So a lot of them weren't around to write their memoir. And also, I think the third reason is more subtle. Privateering is often viewed as legalized piracy. And I make a very strong argument in the book that it's nothing like that. It's nothing like the pirates of Blackbeard or Stede Bonnet or Henry Avery of the late 1600s, early 1700s. These men were not fighting for themselves and attacking vessels of all nations. They were fighting on behalf of their country. And yes, they wanted to make a profit, but they also were as patriotic as the next guy. But I think that people, even back then, and certainly since, have reflexively viewed privateering as legalized piracy, without really understanding what privateering really was during the American Revolution. And it's sort of a casual slight of an entire group of people who played such an important role. And I think because of that, and because so many people automatically assume that they were just pirates, they're somehow not as worthy of documentation or raising up like we do our founding fathers and other people who fought.
It was interesting that you said that some of the critics said that they were they were profiteers.
Right.
I just thought of that.
Right.
They were. This was a matter of they were taking profit over their patriotism. What was the reaction of both political and military leaders in the colonies as this war is being fought? How much did they realize the privateers were doing, and why was there this sort of negative tinge to some of the analysis of the contributions they were making?
Yeah, well, if you look at the actions of the Continental Congress, it's clear that they didn't view profits and patriotism as being mutually exclusive. They're the ones that endorsed privateering across all the colonies, and they could have stopped the practice if they thought it was hurting with the cause or it was unpatriotic, and they never considered doing that at all. The real problem that the people of the day had with privateering was in the Army and the Navy, because a lot of men that they wanted to become soldiers and Navy men, sailors, decided to hop on privateers instead because they thought they had a greater prospect of earning a good payday. And also privateers did absorb a lot of cannons, muskets, and gunpowder. So they were a problem for the Army and the Navy, but I think that could be blown out of proportion. Yet, and so that's why there was a little bit of disparagement during the war against privateering. However, and again, I have a very long section in this book because I found it fascinating. There is no evidence at all in my mind that privateersmen were any less patriotic than anybody else. And in fact, George Washington, who's a great he understands human nature very well. He wrote extensively about the fact that you cannot wage a war more than a couple of months if you don't have the prospect of private gain. He saw it every single day. His soldiers walked off because they weren't getting paid. The land grants that they were promised weren't coming through. Money was a constant concern. And he understood very well that without the prospect of earning a profit, as well as fighting for your country, you weren't going to get a strong fighting force. So depending on Republican virtues and sacrificing your private interest for the public good only takes you so far. So I think that people are too cavalier about discounting privateers, privateersmen, privateering, and their motives when they don't really think about what were the parallel motives of all the other people that were engaged in the battle. And then when you go back to the start of the war and what we talked about earlier, a major reason for this war to erupt in the first place were arguments and complaints and anger about who gets to make money, how. It's money suffuses the American Revolution.
Yeah.
And in a country that now is so money focused, the United States, it's funny to disparage the profit motive as being something that is nasty and we should hide away. It's been part of the American fabric from the beginning.
From what I took away from your book, privateering is eventually outlawed. And I think since the Civil War, you said in the book that it has not, I guess the rules were followed following the Civil War. I guess there was kind of looking the other way as conflict started. You also say it's doubtless we'll ever see privateers again. Why?
Yeah, well, just to clarify what you said before.
Yeah, definitely clear it up.
We still have in our United States Constitution, there is still the opportunity for Congress and the president to issue letters of marque. It was never taken out of our Constitution. What you're referring to is in 1856, after the Crimean War, there was an international agreement that was reached among 55 countries where they outlawed privateering. The Americans, who still wanted to have privateering in their back pocket because they didn't yet have a large navy, decided not to sign on. And it sort of bit the Union side in the behind during the Civil War, because who issued letters of marque during the Civil War but Jefferson Davis and the Confederacy? And that only lasted for about a year and a half and didn't have a major impact on the course of the war. But since that time, even though the United States is not a party to this international treaty, we have never seriously considered or issued letters of marque. There have been calls in the last couple of years to allow for the issuance of letters of marque to, for example, fight terrorism on the high seas or pirates off Somalia. There have been even suggestions that we allow American privateers to attack Chinese ships and Chinese commerce, viewing them as an enemy. I'm not saying this is the case, and I don't talk about this much in the book. I only have a footnote on it because it's a very explosive topic, but I don't think there's any need for us to have privateers in this day and age. We have a very powerful, very competent Navy that I trust. And if we get into a global maritime conflict, I would prefer that the professionals take the lead and not have freelance privateers out there. But it is a question that comes up a lot. A lot of people compare, well, privateering today, is that sort of like, what was it during the Iraqi war where we had private defense contractors doing a lot of stuff that verged on actually fighting the war?
Yeah, I actually had a question about that. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, so there are some parallels perhaps, but again, I have to stress, this is not a topic I debate or discuss much at all in my book because it deserves its own discussion. and I wasn't the person to have it.
How do you see oceans playing a role in war in the future? I mean, just to set this up a little bit, I mean, Iraq and Afghanistan, there certainly were, Navy ships that went for support during those conflicts. But so much of war now is about territory and air superiority, and intelligence and spying and satellites, drones. What is to become of the conflict that is water-based?
It's a little beyond my expertise, but I can make a couple of very simple observations that I think prove that maritime warfare is still critically important. All you have to do is look at the news of the day in the last week, and China having naval exercises off of Taiwan. That's maritime-based saber rattling. What happened during the Iraqi war and other recent wars that we've had? Yes, all those other things are important, but a lot of the air superiority came from the fact that there was an aircraft carrier not too far away that could serve as a home base for those planes to do their sorties. So it's and nuclear submarines. Again, I'm not a military expert today. This has nothing to do with my book, but just reading the newspaper as an educated consumer, I don't think that we are in an era where the maritime component of warfare is not important, or much less important than it always has been. We're not at sea as much, perhaps, but then again, I would push back at that. 90% of all the goods that we consume here in the United States get to us on cargo ships.
Yeah.
I mean, the ocean is still an incredibly important highway, and I can't conceive of a future where the maritime component of a war, and I hope we don't have another big war, but the maritime component is not critically important.
You're super passionate, and I love that. Even about privateersmen from the 1770s. What in your early life inspired you to love the water and our natural resources in the way that you do, that you've written 15 books about it?
Yeah, it's funny. When I was a kid, I wanted to be Jacques Cousteau when I grew up. I was really into marine biology. If you could see my office now, I've got about 400 seashells over here. I was a very serious collector of seashells when I was a kid. I lived in Long Island Sound, off Long Island Sound growing up. And I just always loved the ocean. I always read articles about the ocean. I thought I was going to be a malacologist at one point too, a professional seashell scientist. But my life went in many different twists and turns, and I ended up getting undergraduate, master's, and PhD in environmental policy. I worked in that field for a while, but I always maintained my love and connection to the ocean. I'm not a sailor, but I love the ocean. Where I live right now, where I'm talking to you from, is in Marblehead, Massachusetts, which is right on the ocean. I'm about a quarter of a mile, a little bit more from the beach. I see the ocean virtually every day, whether it's taking a walk, going on a bike ride, or whatever. I love the ocean. There's something about it that just calls to me. And that's why a lot of my books have a maritime focus. Some of them also focus on animals. My background in wildlife and environmental issues has come through in my book on hurricanes, A Furious Sky, my book on whaling in America, Leviathan, my book on the fur trade and the China trade, both of which talk a lot about the sea otter trade and seal trade with China. So I love to pull together both natural history elements and the ocean and American history, and write books about it. I mean, we can go on for a long time, and I'm sure you don't want to, but about how I sort of fell into this writing thing. I was writing from a very early age, but I was writing science stuff. In high school, when I was a senior in high school, I wrote a 150-page paper on the mollusks or seashells of Long Island Sound. So that's when I thought I was going to be a scientist. I realized at college I wasn't that good at lab work.
You're a word scientist now.
Words, yeah, I'm a word scientist. So it's been a long and strange trip, as Grateful Dead says, but it's been a fun one.
Do you find that states that are along the ocean, what have you, Maryland, New Jersey, New York, Massachusetts, North Carolina, South Carolina, do you find that those areas are more receptive and have more people who are interested in your ocean-based books?
I want to say yes, but I have no statistics that prove that. I hear from a lot of fans that are in the middle of the country. And I've had books that have done very well in Denver and St. Louis and Chicago. But I think my guess would be that most of the people who are interested in the books that I write are probably along or within 50 or 75 miles of the coast. But I'm not sure of that. I mean, my pirate book, I've heard from people all over the United States, other countries. If you're interested in pirates, you're interested in pirates. If you're interested, if you're interested in the American Revolution, I would not say that people who are interested in the American Revolution only live in the original 13 colonies.
I felt like I was in New England when I was going through this book. There's something about reading about the ocean that makes me feel like I'm along Cape Cod or something like that.
Yeah.
What is next? If I dare ask, what is next for you in your writing exploits? Am I allowed to ask that question?
Yeah, sure. Hey, you're allowed to ask and I'll answer. Most authors don't answer. I've always been of the belief, a lot of people used to tell me when I started writing, don't ever tell anybody what you're working on, your topic. Somebody will steal it. My attitude is, you want to steal it, go head to head. That's fine. No problem. I don't own the idea, but I have a book contract and I'm already well into writing a book about 5 men, 2 of whom are Americans, 3 of whom are British, who were marooned on the Falkland Islands during the War of 1812. And it's a story about not just the marooning, which was sort of a treacherous affair, but it's a story about the war. It's a story about Australia, believe it or not. It's a story about sealing, people that went after seals to sell seal skins and in China. So it's a great maritime story. It's a great human interest story. And it's been fun working on it so far.
Well, here's the deal, folks. He's already well into it. So if you want to steal it, you really got to work fast.
Yes.
Dr. Eric J. Dolin, the author of Rebels at Sea, Privateering in the American Revolution. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. I had a good time.
Me too. Check out the book. Check out his website, ericjdolin.com. He's on social media at Eric J. Dolin. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axel Bank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Axel Bank History. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. We'll see you next time. Thanks.